So, Paul, 1949, you're elected as the youngest member of Parliament in Canadian history. How old are you then?
I was 25, and I'm celebrating the 70th anniversary in just a few days.
It's amazing. What made you think you could do that at 25?
Not being very realistic. I guess in those days you think you can do anything, and so I tried to do the impossible, and it worked. But and also I learned the first lesson of politics, which was that backbenchers don't influence policy on anything very much, let alone monetary and fiscal policies. So I had a lot to learn, but I was in the House, and it was a start, and it was basically a miracle, I think, that I got in, because the odds were 15 to 1 against me on election day in the local pub, but it happened.
It's amazing. And you're saying like backbenchers couldn't make adjustments, so you fixed that too, because 8 years later you were elected as the youngest cabinet. You were chosen as the youngest cabinet member in Canada.
Yes, I was the last of the Saint Laurent appointees, which makes me gives me the dubious honor of being the dean of the Privy Council, the senior member of the Privy Council, just ahead of Prince Philip. But that and a lot of money will buy you a cigar, you know.
So you beat the odds, you get into the House, you beat the odds, you make it to cabinet, and now you have to unify the Canadian Armed Forces, which was not terribly popular at the time.
That's an understatement. It was a real war, and every other minister since the Second World War had said that it should be done. It was almost impossible again. And what I learned was that it is difficult, bordering on impossible, to change anything of substance in government, because the system, the built-in system of civil servants and so on, is so rigid and so strong that they really think they run the country and they own the country, and once they get an idea, they won't change it if they can possibly avoid it. So what we did was really another miracle. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara said Hellyer's done what every Minister of Defense wanted to do but didn't have the guts to do.
Why was it important to do?
Because the system was so inefficient. The three services acted independently. They were not working as a team. Even during the war, they were not working as a team. And worst of all, it was that the three services were planning for 3 different kinds of wars when I took over as minister. So this doesn't make any sense. You've got to have some kind of a consensus, because you can't plan, buy equipment, and do all that sort of thing, and go in 3 different directions at the same time.
So 14 years ago, you do find yourself presented with some pretty remarkable information that was new to you. Can you tell me about that?
Well, yes, I really was not into the ET and the UFO file at all. When I was minister, I had sighting reports, and on reflection, they were about the same as in other countries' experience. About 80% of the sightings reports were natural phenomena, and about 15 or 20% were unidentified, so they fit the definition of unidentified flying objects. But I was too busy unifying the armed forces to spend much time on that file. Bob McNamara used to say he would tell me anything I wanted to know, but I didn't know the right questions to ask. So I finished that portfolio and got on my way without ever knowing a lot of the things that were going on. I don't know how much he would have told me, probably quite a bit at the time, because we were quite close. But I wound up post-war with this file so far from my mind that it was way down on the list. And it was only, well, again, I'm not sure it was happenstance, but I seemed to be picked to carry the banner for former public officials in the G8 and say that that UFOs are as real as airplanes flying overhead. And I had to assure my bride of a week from the day that I went public that it was a one-off and so on. And she said, well, if you think it's important, go ahead. Because I was afraid that the United States Air Force, who have a habit of shooting first and asking questions after, would start shooting at the visitors from other planets and other star systems and maybe get us into a galactic war at some stage. And the way things are working out over the last 14 years, my concern was, I think, very real, and just as concerned today as I was then.
When you were originally given this information, how did you go about confirming it? Because you've been a public servant and a politician for so long, you're going to want to confirm this information. How did you go about doing that? And I don't want you to portray any confidences, but just...
Well, first of all, I was encouraged to go into this field by a young man by the name of Pierre Junot, young bilingual chap from Ottawa, who started sending me stuff on the subject, and I told him honestly I didn't have time to read about it or worry about it. He said, well, put it on the shelf for a rainy day. He encouraged me to watch an ABC's special, 2 hours, put together by Peter Jennings, the late Peter Jennings of Ottawa. And so I did watch it, and there were former Air Force pilots, U.S. Air Force pilots, and former civilian pilots, air traffic controllers, policemen, all said they had seen UFOs. And after it, I had to say to myself, well, why would they lie? I mean, they're not getting paid to lie, surely. They must be telling the truth, but it was sort of put in the back crevice of my mind. Well, then Pierre had sent me a book called The Day After Roswell, and I said, that looks like a good read for my summer reading at the Rental Lodge, our little place in Muskoka. And so I took it. And I was about halfway through when I was realizing that it was the real thing, because I recognized the names of the generals and the airfields from my days in Ottawa. My nephew came along and asked me what I was reading. I told him. He said, well, I'm a skeptic. I said, well, it's a free country, more or less, getting less all the time. So you can be a skeptic if you want to. So he went home, and a couple of days later he called and said, I called the general and told him what you were reading, and he said, every word's true, but more and more. Where can I get a copy of the book? So I had already decided that it was true and that it was the real thing. But hearing that the general had said so sounded like confirmation. But before going public, I decided I should get it from his lips personally. So I asked my nephew to give him a heads up that I was to call and to get his number for me, which he did. So I called him, and before I could even say, hello, how are you? He said, every word is true and more. And then he spent 20 minutes talking about the more to the extent that he could without breaking his oath to a great an extent. And the most important thing he said was, there have been face-to-face meetings between United States officials and visitors from other star systems, period.
Why do you think he told you that?
I think he respected me and felt maybe that it was good that I should have that information.
But it's also dangerous information.
Well, of course, the whole knowing anything about what's going on is dangerous information if you start talking about it. But in any event, I was convinced that I had to speak out, and that's when I decided to accept the outstanding invitation from Victor Vigiani and Mike Bird to go to their Exopolitics conference at the University of Toronto and say that airplanes are as real as at least that UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. I felt a responsibility to humankind to get the discussion into the public domain to the extent possible. And of course, I've been working at it for 13 years since with some modest results, but still only like a drop in the bucket compared to what has to happen next.
Do you ever regret it? It's a big decision.
No, not at all, because I think it was intended to be. I'm a believer, and I think that the creator of the cosmos said we need some more people out there spreading the word, and you're somebody who has the ability to do that, and the training and the credibility. And then if you look back over my career path, you can see that I almost was not appointed Parliamentary Secretary to Defense, in which case I would never have wound up as Minister of Defense, in which case I wouldn't have had half the credibility that I have as a former Minister of Defense, because people expect me to tell the truth, and they expect me to know something, and to tell them what I know, and give them the straight goods. So I think the whole thing ties together in a very interesting and very thoughtful manner, and I appreciate actually the opportunity, even though I know that it has put my life in the crosshairs of a couple of people that don't really appreciate what I'm saying.
Are you concerned about repercussions?
Well, you have to be concerned, but at the same time, I'm 95, going on 96 years old. I've had a good life. I know what happens to people when they die, and I know that it's good, not bad. And so I'm not the least bit concerned about being bumped off, saying the worst thing they can do to me is kill me, and that would be a promotion in a way. So say your piece and accept the consequences, whatever they may happen to be.
For somebody beginning down this path, what is the single piece of evidence or the single event or the single document that you would suggest for someone to begin with, the most compelling thing that you've come across?
Well, I think I would start them with Corso's book, and then after that to read 10 or 20 of the other books by ufologists, Linda Moulton Howe, of course, and Paul Harris, and Grant Cameron, and the whole list of people who spent years and years checking the veracity of the information which has been made available. Yes. But Kravis Walton, I was just saying, I invited him to Las Vegas 12 years ago and spent hours asking him questions. And at the end of the weekend, I was satisfied that he was telling the truth. And Jim Sparks, I spent a lot of time talking to him. And finally, I was satisfied that he was telling the truth. So those were two examples I put in my first book that mentioned this subject, Light at the End of the Tunnel. And then in the meantime, I had been in London, and Nick Pope gave me a case to follow up. And the only reason was that it had gotten into the public domain somehow through the Brits, who had leaked it, I don't know, probably accidentally. And so he gave me that. And so I was in Washington for the National Prayer Breakfast, and I phoned Colonel Halt, Charles Halt, and asked if he would see me, and he said, I don't normally talk about these things, but if Nick Pope recommended you, I'll see you. So he did, and I after the show was over down there, I got a car and drove down to his gated community that he was in charge of, and he told me in 2 hours, in answer to my general questions, all about the Brentwater Forest case, and it was absolutely authentic. And I can recognize a hard-nosed colonel when I see one, And I said, this is not the kind of guy that's going to make up a story for you. This is somebody that's going to tell you the truth. And the biggest truth of the whole thing was the second or third incident of sighting was when his commanding officer said, well, you go out and deal with this situation. And he said he marched out the door saying, I'm going to put an end to this nonsense once and for all. And of course, just instead of doing that, he wound up having his life changed forever. And that's the kind of evidence that, I would say is 100%. You just can't beat it at all.
So with what you know and what's happened over the last 2 years in terms of these admissions by the U.S. military and other leaks and information dumps, it really does feel like we are rounding about a soft disclosure, where they're kind of easing us into the idea. Does that play to you, or what do you think is happening?
I think it's part of the game. They're not telling us the whole truth. They're telling us selected truths. They're telling us convenient truths, just enough to say to us there is a problem and we need more money to build more ships to cope with the problem.
What is that problem?
Well, the problem is an imaginary one that they're conning us with, and that is that we have something to fear from the extraterrestrials, when in fact they are the problem. The cabal that is running the United States and has been for decades and running much of the world has plans for what they call a new world order, which sounds like a utopia, but when you get through the fog, it is what they intend to do is a world government, unelected, a fascist government of, by, and for them, at the expense of all of the rest of the people. And that's what they're having up their sleeves, in my opinion. And so I think their disclosure and why they would start with something so contemporary instead of going back to the beginning. Well, I was going to say I don't know, but I do know, because they want us to think that some of this stuff is new, and that they haven't known about it for decades and decades before, and that they haven't reacted to it already. So I think it's part of the con job.
If you could leave people with a single message, a single call to action, what would that be?
It would be for the Congress of the United States immediately to set up a committee, bipartisan, to hear witnesses who want to tell the truth and are willing to tell the truth, but all they need is an amnesty from the National Security Act, because otherwise, if they did that, their lives might be endangered, certainly their pensions would be in danger, and they would have other penalties which would prohibit them from telling the truth. And they have to have an environment where they can say exactly what they want to say and exactly what the facts are. And if they do that, then I think the Congress will take the necessary steps to end the problem, or to mitigate it to the point that the planned New World Order, as it is presently conceived, will not happen. Most of the races in our galaxy are humanoids. They're not exactly the same as we are. They're not put together exactly the same, but we're certainly first cousins. And you, if you were meeting one on the street, you'd never guess, unless you were very, very sensitive, that it was anybody except somebody from downtown or uptown or somewhere else. But when you start going outside the galaxy, then you get more insectoids, and you get the short grays and the long, tall grays and all these other forms that look different. And they're all part of the same creation, but they have evolved in different ways from different beginnings, and consequently don't look the same.
Now, I've read a few books and had a chance to talk with Dr. David Jacobs last year at the MUFON Symposium. And he writes books on hybrids. And he has worked with thousands of abductees with these incredible stories. And basically the synopsis is that there is a program for hybrids, and eventually they will be living amongst us. In your experience over the years, have you come across any information on that?
Well, yes and no. Yes, that this was really implied in the deal that was made between the United States and the Greys, that they could abduct a certain number of people. They haven't quite lived up to the agreement because they don't report what they do. But so they have been doing this, and some of the estimates of the number of people that they have abducted worldwide are just astronomical. And it gets you into the question of creating a new race, a new hybrid race with greater IQs than we have, and so on. And this has been going on, well, for quite a long while now. But this isn't the first time in the galaxy or the cosmos that this has happened, and certainly I think we are partly hybrids of a different sort. It's just that our genetic makeup is different than it was in the days of the Neanderthals, and probably different than it will be at some future time. And that seems to be the way the cookie crumbles, as they say. And so,
getting back to the Colonel Corso book, when you came out in 2005 and said UFOs are as real as the planes flying over top, does it make you feel good that you've got a little bit of vindication now that recently in the last month, documentation from Admiral Tom Wilson has come out with him saying back in the 90s that Corso's book is basically true?
Yeah, well, he's not the first one to say that. It was Michael Wolff, Dr. Michael Wolff, who in a radio broadcast in, I think it was 2000, who said that it was absolutely true. Well, I think absolutely is probably too good a word, but I would say substantially true, because I've never written a book or read a book that didn't have a typo or two in it somewhere, and maybe a slip or something. But it was to all intents and purposes true, which is what you want when you read a book. And I think that Corso's book met that criteria. I think that's the reason that my source, one of my sources, was willing to confirm that it was true, and that a lot of other people have since, including Philip Corso's son and others that were in the know. And certainly Paul Harris is very much of that opinion, having known Corso and worked with him and been very active in his promoting him. So yes, I think it's a good primer, because it gets you into a number of areas, but then you have to go on from there, because Corso was considering that the aliens were a threat, and he would probably modify that today and say one or two species are a threat, but most of them are not a threat. Most of them are friendly, they're our neighbors and are probably our relatives, and they want to help us. And they would have helped us certainly with medical problems and agricultural problems and all of these things, if we had just been willing to give up our atomic weapons, because this is the thing that they fear about us most, because the way the cosmos is constructed, it's a hole, and every time a bomb goes off here, pardon me, it affects well, the whole cosmos really just goes out in waves everywhere.
Two last questions. Second last one is going to be, with the atomic bombs going off, the testing, etc., and how the the ETs were very interested in that. There were many reports at ICBM silos. The Bentwaters case, on one of those nights, they were buzzing the storage areas where the nukes were kept. So do you believe that they are certainly trying to step in, or were at some point and saying, you got to stop this?
I think it is their fondest hope that we will stop without intervention, because as I understand it, this is not the first time that the world's been faced with that dilemma, that there have been previous catastrophes. How many, I'm not exactly sure, but several. And they don't want us to have another one. And if they can stop us and keep the planet habitable, that would be their fondest dream, I do believe, because it's one of the nicest planets, I'm told, and one that they like to visit and sometimes maybe exploit some of its resources and this sort of thing. And so they don't want us to, one more time, duplicate what Mars did and get into a showdown that wound up destroying one planet and making Mars uninhabitable unless you went underground. So their stake in it is very high, and the frequency of visits increased very, very much, very substantially after the first atomic bomb was tested, and then again after the first atomic bomb was put off in Hiroshima on my birthday, unfortunately. And so they want for us, but we're stubborn. We're warfaring. We have a history of bloody wars, and we kill millions of people. And for some reason, there are a lot of people around who just think that that's the way to go, and that you protect yourself by having a bigger proportion of your national income go into armaments and into all other areas, including healthcare and education and all of the good things of life. And then ultimately, if you get a race going, which is going on at the present time, certainly, and a space race which has begun, and if it isn't stopped, if I say heaven help us, I guess I mean it literally, because I'm not sure that we have the brains to stop it ourselves.
You have a great following of young people. I'm sure you know this by now. The internet, and it's really remarkable. And I think what they glean from you is that you are essentially trying to save the world, and by exposing the cabal, the bank fraud, the fact that free energy is out there, zero-point energy, if we would be allowed to use it as public. And these are all things that if they can change, they can save the world. So to the young people, what would you say to them?
I would say you have to help save the world for your own use and benefit. And if you don't do it, no one will, because your elders are so entrenched in their ways that they will put their own financial benefits ahead of saving the world and ahead of saving your future. And that is wrong, morally and otherwise. So go to it and make sure that the word spreads that we have to do these things. We have to use zero-point energy right away. We have to convert the world economy from oil to zero-point energy immediately, hopefully in 5 years, but certainly the Paris account, that's political play. That's just for show. And you forget all that stuff and get on with the job. But it means a total revolution in the thinking, and it has to start with the young people, because it's certainly not going to start with the people who are running the show today.